Chapter 1. The Fifth Child. 2 decades after the war in heaven, the Earth was a dying world. As the dust settled from the epic battle, thousands of disabled starships fell from orbit and crashed. The violence of these impacts were similar to meteor strikes and nuclear weapon blasts. Fires broke out in cities and wilderness alike. Before a few months passed, the skies were choked with ash and soot. At first, people were too busy celebrating the great triumph to notice the damage, but it soon became apparent. Fields were beginning to wither away, the sunlight was cold, whole forests burned down, and then the death began. Oceans, seas, lakes, rivers, and all other kinds of waterways were suddenly choked with dead fish. Herbivorous animals starved to death in search of green leaves and grass. The horrible truth was clear. The Earth had been thrown into nuclear winter. The layers of smoke in the air were just thick enough to block out the light of the sun. It was the largest mass death in the history of the world. Farmers struggled to salvage their crops, to save their livestock, but there was almost nothing to be done. Then came the famines and the cold. A dark silence fell over the Earth as untold millions of lives were extinguished across the globe. What cities remained standing fell dark as their inhabitants fled to the countryside, looking for new sources of food and water. But the mass extinction was not total. Scattered across the world, some 1 billion humans survived, along with a sizable fraction of Earth's flora and fauna. Yet the world was nowhere near recovery. The air was still full of soot. Dry fog hugged the landscape and was not dispersed by the rising of the sun. Daylight itself was cold and gave little energy, and sometimes the winter snow would fall as far south as the Sahara and not melt until May. Meanwhile, whole layers of the atmosphere were damaged or destroyed, leaving anything and everything on the ground vulnerable to the sun's dangerous radiation. Life became difficult and miserable. Eventually, after about 10 years, the nuclear winter came to an end. It was followed by nuclear summer. Heat from the sun became trapped beneath the cloud layer, warming up the world year after year. The snowfall stopped. What little moisture remained in the air dried out, and wildfire raged across the landscape. Now the people of Earth were faced with death by fire and famine instead of the usual freezing and famine. But there were plenty of people who refused to simply wait for the end. Many of the soldiers, scientists, and engineers who once made up the military force behind the liberation of Earth were still active. XCOM lived, if only just barely. The heroes who saved the world from the Elders and then from the Beast were still hard at work, now trying to stop an ecological disaster from finishing what their enemies had started. Leading this effort were 2 people, a man and woman who called themselves Stormbreakers 2 decades ago. Blake Robinson and Chihiro Tachibana were friends of Jericho when she was alive, and great heroes in their own time. Now they spent their time cleaning up the mess of their own battles, so their children could inherit a good world from them. Blake, Chihiro, and their children lived, traveled, and worked together. They were a very close-knit family. They did have a place they called home, but they spent so much time together aboard their spaceship that the title easily applied to this vessel as well. It is this ship where we find the Robinson family and the subject of our story, flying east on a sweltering June morning. June 27th, 2060, Manhattan, Kansas. The JSDF Archangel throttled down her engines and began to glide over the American Great Plains. The spaceplane was about 25 years old, her white hull streaked and stained by the weather. Inside the ship, the entire Robinson family prepared for landing. Blake, the family patriarch, occupied the engineer's chair in the back of the cockpit. A veteran of 3 major wars, The 47-year-old warrior was not the man he once was. His right arm was burned and desiccated to the point where it was clearly useless, and he kept it pressed against his chest in a tight sling. His hair was gray, and wrinkles gave the middle-aged soldier a premature, grandfatherly look. In the right-hand pilot's seat, Blake's wife was flying the spaceplane. Like her husband, Chihiro Tachibana bore multiple scars from old war wounds, most notably on her neck and hands. Her long black hair was streaked with gray, but her blue eyes contained just a little bit of that intense energy she was known for in her youth. Next to her, two weapons rested against the pilot's seat: an ancient pistol that resembled an old-world flintlock, known as the Shadow Keeper. The other weapon was a black and silver sword with a secondary blade concealed in the handle. This katana had once belonged to the Elder's chosen assassin, and now stayed with the one who killed its previous owner. The left-hand pilot seat was filled by a 21-year-old man. Alexander Robinson took after his mother. He had her pale skin, small size, straight hair, and rounded face, but his dark eyes could only have come from his father. Alexander, sometimes called Alex, was close upon the prime of his life. He looked strong enough to fist-fight a muton, and the way he handled the ship's controls with ease and confidence showed that he was the best pilot in the family. In the crew compartment, the 4 remaining Robinson children had nothing to do but wait for the landing. This room was still built for war. Computer workstations were installed in the walls of the fuselage on either side, and would have allowed the users to operate the spaceplane's many sensors and weapons, but none of them were powered on today. Sitting at the defunct weapons control station, Asuna Robinson was about to fall asleep. She was the eldest of the 5 children, at 23 years old. She inherited many traits from her father, including dark skin and curly hair. When one of her brothers walked down the aisle and passed by her, Asuna opened her eyes, raised her hands to chest height, and made a series of gestures that her brother understood. Unlike all 4 of her siblings, Asuna Robinson was completely deaf. She was born during the war in heaven itself, and spent the first 4 hours of her life being carried across a live battlefield. The near-constant sound of explosions, gunfire, and shouting had caused permanent damage to Asuna's ears. For as long as she lived, the only sound she would ever hear was a high-pitched whine. Thus, Asuna relied on hand signals, body language, and facial expressions to communicate, since the spoken word meant nothing to her. James Robinson and his twin brother, Josiah, spotted Asuna's gesture as they went by. They looked at their older sister and non-verbally promised to behave themselves. Asuna gave them a suspicious glare, watching them until they were out of sight. The twins might have been born at the same time, but they didn't really resemble one another. James and Josiah were fraternal twins, and mercifully easy to tell apart. James had dark skin, while Josiah was pale. Josiah had curly hair, while James' hair was straight. James was tall, and his brother was... okay, they were both tall. Another trait they had in common was troublemaking. James and Josiah were a mischievous pair, and they were each other's lifelong partner in crime. As soon as Asuna drifted off to sleep again, the twins continued slowly and quietly making their way towards the back of the spaceplane, where their younger sister was alone. Halfway along the fuselage, a bulkhead door separates the crew compartment from the living quarters. Here, the left and right sides of the fuselage were lined with bunk beds, separated from one another by a dark curtain that divided the sleeping area into men's and women's section. The bunk beds themselves were more like nooks, with sleeping bags held in place by straps to allow a person to be comfortable in zero gravity. In the back of the living quarters was a small dining area, a simple table surrounded by stools bolted onto the floor. Behind it was a kitchen, but most of the equipment was packed away in a series of locked drawers, due to the fact that cooking wasn't really feasible in low gravity. Sitting at the table alone was a young girl, the one whose very story we are here to learn. 14-year-old Akira Robinson didn't just take after her mother, she was the spitting image of a young Chihiro Tachibana. Akira had the same pale skin, round face, straight black hair, and vivid blue eyes as her mother. She was also just as short and scrawny now as her mother was at this age. On the hazy morning when Akira's story began, she was in a good mood. She had 2 things to look forward to, and they made her feel excited. Just 3 days from now, on June 30th, Akira would be celebrating her 15th birthday. Both of her parents had promised that once Akira turned 15, they would start teaching her to fly the Archangel. But that wasn't the only piece of good news. In fact, there was something far more wonderful to look forward to. Someone she desperately wanted to meet was on the ground waiting for her. Keeping her back to the only door, Akira reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out one of her most prized possessions. It was a photograph of a man, dressed in a flight suit emblazoned with the insignia of XCOM and a mission patch on his chest that read HMAS Bushranger, Australian Defence Force. The man in the picture was a Caucasian fellow with friendly hazel eyes, a strong chin, and wavy blonde hair. Most people would see this individual and declare him to be a good-looking or fine fellow, or perhaps use the more clinical phrase, a fine specimen of human health. Akira, however, believed this man to be nothing short of hypnotizing. The longer she stared at his handsome visage, the faster her own heart thumped. Finally, Akira turned the picture over to read the handwritten scribble on the back. It was a message from the man in the image. Dear Akira, thank you for the thoughtful birthday present. I hope to someday return the favor. Keep learning to fly and aim ever higher. Future pilot of the Archangel. Signed, Emmanuel Luis Espinosa Perez. Mission Specialist, HMAS Bushranger, XCOM. Mutare ad custodium. Akira's heart fluttered one more time. Even though Emmanuel Espinosa had never actually swept her off her feet, she felt like this was happening every time she looked at the picture. Perhaps this was how her parents felt for one another when they were young. The girl pressed the picture into her chest and lost herself in romantic fantasies for a few moments until the sound of a door closing caught her attention. Gasping, Akira stuffed the picture back into her pocket and looked around just in time to see her twin brothers enter the living space. James grinned at Akira in a mischievous way, while Josiah locked the door behind him. "Hey, Kira," James said. "What you doing?" Akira drew her knees up to her chest and looked away from her brothers. She'd been putting up with these two for almost 15 years, but some days were worse than others. She got the feeling that today was going to be one of those bad days. "Leave me alone," Akira mumbled. "I don't want to talk to you." "Oh, not feeling friendly today?" Josiah said. "Come on, Kira. We just wanted to share the good news. Some friends are meeting us in town this week." Akira looked up and then rearranged her hair with one hand so that her bangs fell down to cover one of her eyes. "Friends? Like who?" James and Josiah rattled off names while counting on their fingers. Well, Asu's boyfriend will be there for starters," Josiah said, referring to Asuna by a nickname. "Nezzie's coming too," James added. "And the emo. So many familiar faces." Josiah's voice drifted in a nostalgic way. "I guess they're coming for Dad's birthday. Also, I heard a certain blonde guy's gonna be there. Some unimportant guy whose picture you've had under your pillow for the past 6 months," James added with a sneer. Akira felt her heart drop into her stomach. "What?" she gasped. "How'd you know?" "Doesn't matter how we know." Josiah looked at his fingernails in a nonchalant way. "Fact is, we know that you're like head over heels in love with a man 12 years older than you." Then Josiah clutched his hands to his chest, pretending to be scandalized. "Oh, what will Mom and Dad say when they find out?" James followed his brother's lead, clapping his hands to his face. "Our sweet little sister, bewitched and led astray by a strange man with irresistible golden locks." James put on an expression of fake shock. "We should really tell Dad before something happens." Akira shuddered at the thought. Her mind's eye was suddenly full of scenarios in which her parents, in one way or another, prevented her from seeing Emmanuel again. Instinctively, Akira blurted out, "No, don't, come on." James and Josiah fell silent. They looked at one another, grinning. "You're right, Kira," James said. "Telling Mom and Dad won't do any good. We need to go to the source." "Yeah, we are your big brothers after all," Josiah piled on, cracking his knuckles. "We should go straight to the source. What do you think, bro? Think we can take that Espinoza guy in a fight?" "Stop," Akira pleaded. "Don't tell anyone. Leave Emmanuel alone, can't you? Please? Please, please, please don't tell anyone. I mean it." Josiah rubbed his chin thoughtfully, or at least he was pretending to be thoughtful. Then Akira's brothers finally revealed their true intentions. "So you don't want us blurting your secret all over, huh?" James's voice took a tone Akira knew meant only bad things for her. "Okay, Kira, you can buy our silence. For a price." "Oh, come on," Akira whined. "That's blackmail." Josiah put one arm around Akira's shoulder and held her close, ignoring her vigorous resistance to his embrace. "Oh, what's a little blackmail between siblings?" Josiah replied in a casual tone. "We've got something you want, our silence and discretion, and you've got something we want, specifically that big bag of candy you got from the Ackermans." Akira felt herself deflating in her brother's grip. "Well, I guess I can give you a few pieces." "Nuh-uh," James vetoed. "We want the whole thing." At that moment, the space plane nosed down in a gentle dive. Blake's voice sounded over the intercom. "All right, kids, we're in the final descent now. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." "Last chance, Kira," Josiah said. "What's it gonna be?" Cursing under her breath, Akira broke free of her brother's grip and moved towards her bunk bed. She stuffed her hand inside of the pillowcase and retrieved a small plastic bag filled with brightly colored sweets. "Just so you both know, I totally hate you," Akira snarked at her brothers. "What kind of jerks blackmail their own sister? You're big, stupid bullies." James snatched the bag from her and said, "Good doing business with you, little sis." The twins turned to leave, but before they could put one hand on the handle, the hatchway swung open. The two young men took a step backwards as their father entered the dining area, a deep scowl on his face. "Oh, hey, Dad!" James quickly hid the bag of candy behind his back. "I thought you were preparing to land." "So did I," Blake replied, blocking the only exit with his own body. "But then my most responsible child told me to check on you. Said you looked like you were up to something." "Azzy," Josiah muttered under his breath. Blake's eyes quickly flickered to Akira. She saw his expression change right away. He must have figured out what was going on by reading her own face. "Boys, whatever you just stole from your sister, give it back," Blake said, sounding annoyed. Josiah put a hand to his mouth, acting scandalized again. "Why would we ever dream of robbing our own sister?" he replied. "We would never." "If that's true, then let me see what your brother's holding," Blake said, pointing to James with his good hand. When James hesitated, Akira piped up. "Dad, they've got the candy Sophie and Sophia gave me." Blake narrowed his eyes at the twins, and they both took a half step back. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. "Boys, you're almost 18 years old. I would have expected you to grow out of this childish behavior by now. But seeing as you haven't, you'll be repacking the parachutes after we land. Alone." Both of the twins dropped their jaws. "But Dad," Josiah protested. The weather forecast said it's going to be over 120 degrees outside tonight. Give Akira's candy back now, and I'll send an android to give you water every few minutes, Blake said. Otherwise, you'll have to carry the water yourselves and repack the chutes. A moment later, Akira had her candy back, and the twins left the room, grumbling. Blake watched them go until his youngest daughter suddenly flung her arms around him in a great big hug. "Thank you, Dad, thank you," Akira half cried. Blake patted her on the top of the head and reassured her. "You've got nothing to worry about. I'd never let anything bad happen to you. I love you." "Love you too." The Archangel swooped low over the southern shore of Lake Milford and came in to land at a ramshackle airport. Hitting the tarmac at high speed, the spaceplane's brakes struggled to slow the massive craft and would have set the wheels on fire if not for two large parachutes deployed from the tail, slowing the vessel to a halt. The spaceplane touched down on a massive slab of what would have been an airport runway about 50 years ago. In fact, very little of what was once the city of Manhattan was still standing. Located in the very heart of Kansas, this region used to be the home of a military base that was nearly 3 times the size of the city that hosted it. While Manhattan fell to ruin, Fort Riley was annihilated, the only reminder of its presence being the airport runway, an impact crater about a mile to the northwest, and a perfectly round hill sticking out of the otherwise flat terrain roughly 10 miles due north. In between the wreckage of Fort Riley and the ruins of Manhattan, a new settlement had sprung up. Some 500 ramshackle buildings stood on what used to be the main road, all built from reclaimed canvas, corrugated metal, and timber. A high wall surrounded the town. Defenders armed with rifles stood underneath canopies, allowing huge fans to keep them somewhat cool. The only entrance or exit to this place was a single gate built into the wall. This place was the colony. For the Robinson family and many former members of XCOM, this was home. Curious children braved the overpowering heat of the early morning to stand on the outer perimeter of the town and watch the landing. Men carried large tarps and poles onto the tarmac, quickly erecting a covered lane between the taxiway and the gate. In a matter of minutes, a series of long canopies were raised between the motionless Archangel and the colony, allowing people to move and work away from the dangerous light of the sun. One of the locals rapped his knuckles on the hatch and stepped back. The Archangel's boarding ramp lowered to the ground, and the Robinson family disembarked. The spaceplane had a powerful air conditioning system in the cabin, so Akira and her family were buffeted by a blast of hot air as they exited the ship. Akira reached up and felt her hair starting to get frizzy, while Asuna, Alexander, James, and Josiah disembarked ahead of the family. Akira stayed with her parents. Not out of choice. Chihiro wrapped her hand around her daughter's shoulders and was holding her very close. Her father descended the boarding ramp and shook hands with the man who'd come out to greet them. "Tucker!" Blake shook hands with the man. "When did you guys get in?" Former XCOM soldier Corey Tucker was a black American, completely bald and looking to be in a state of perpetual exhaustion. He was wearing a flight suit similar to the kind worn by the crew of Battlemaster-class gunships such as the Archangel. Tucker's flight suit was unzipped and the upper half of the uniform was wrapped around his waist, leaving the old man wearing just a tank top over his torso. Even so, the heat of the day was clearly getting to him. "We landed about 3 hours before you did," Corey Tucker replied, "before the sun came up. You have anything you need to unload?" "We've got an atmosphere generator in the hold," Alex chimed in. "Salvaged it from a Vanian shipwreck in Western Africa." Corey Tucker looked astounded. "An atmogen?" he gasped. "Oh man, that's a lucky break." The Robinsons stood to one side as 2 more people approached. They were members of the same starship crew as Corey himself. Alexei Volobyov and Dwayne Gardner greeted their friends warmly. "We'll take care of this, Tachibana," Dwayne said to Chihiro. "Why don't you take your children and get out of the heat?" weather forecast says it's going to be triple digits all day. The Robinson women didn't need to be asked twice. The morning sun had just barely risen, but the local temperature was already exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Before the men set to work unloading the spaceplane, they all took off their shirts and passed around bottles of water. Chihiro, Asuna, and Akira left at a brisk pace, following the shadow of the covered walkway into the colony. The colony of Myron was built on the Kansas River, which was far smaller and narrower than it was 50 years ago. The biggest structures were repurposed shipping containers, stacked on top of one another and connected to form more complex buildings. The vast majority of structures were constructs of corrugated metal and improvised concrete, thrown together by survivalists who flocked to the site after it was established. Finally, there was a smattering of simple tents all over the place. Varying in size, shape, and color, they were sometimes found in clusters, but more often than not just scattered all over the place. If one was to look at the colony from above, they would have been forgiven for thinking the entire settlement was a single solid object. There were no roads or streets, no avenues or alleyways to be seen. In fact, such things did exist in the colony, they were just hidden. Every possible open space between buildings was covered by awnings, solid panels, metal rooftops, canvas sheets, or some other kind of overhead cover that sheltered pedestrians from the dangerous sunlight. In the center of the colony was the Kansas River, and along its northern shores was a complex of large buildings, leftover military installations from the Second Hyperspace War. Surrounded by a smaller wall of its own, this military base was somewhat like the keep in the center of a medieval castle. Chihiro guided her daughters towards this facility with great care, holding Akira by the hand and keeping a tight grip on Asuna's shoulder. Each time the trio crossed a roadway, Chihiro would put both hands out to stop her children from crossing until she was sure it was safe. Whenever a man turned his gaze onto the girls, Chihiro would put one hand on the scabbard tied to her waist, making sure the stranger got a good long look at the katana. All the time, Chihiro would constantly warn her daughters to be careful, keep your heads on a swivel, and let me do the talking if it comes to that. Asuna and Akira may have been young, but they were not stupid. Chihiro was being protective of her children, as any parent should. But both girls were aware of the fact that their mother was going slightly overboard, doing too much. Asuna, for her part, was very annoyed at her parents' overprotective tendencies. Throughout the trip, she would constantly try to break free of her mother's grip and remind Chihiro that she was 23 years old and no longer needed a chaperone. This touched off the same argument that Chihiro and Asuna had been having for years. Akira could practically predict the words, "Mom, I am an adult. I do not need to be babied anymore." Asuna signed with her hands. "I can take care of myself." Chihiro replied in sign language as well. "You cannot go out alone, not even here. People might take advantage of you." "I'm deaf, not dumb." Asuna spelled out each letter with her hand to emphasize the point. Akira, for her part, actually liked it when her parents put in too much effort to keep her safe. It was, by far and away, the most attention they paid directly to her. Blake and Chihiro were so busy with their work on the project and raising 4 other children that Akira sometimes felt neglected or forgotten. So when Chihiro pulled Akira close to her while she was waiting for a caravan of traders to pass by, Akira put one arm around her mother and turned the protective hold into an affectionate hug. She loved the reassurance that her parents were looking out for her. Finally, Chihiro, Akira, and Asuna reached the inner gate in the center of the colony. 2 soldiers recognized Chihiro on sight and said, "Welcome home, Corporal Tachibana." The inner gate opened, and 5 people came out to greet the Robinsons. Or rather, 4 people and an android. Asuna squealed and jumped for joy before her boyfriend grabbed her around the middle and lifted her into the air, kissing her passionately. Christopher Wright, a sandy-haired man with green eyes, pulled away from Asuna and saw the expression on Chihiro's face. He put Asuna down, trying to hide how much he was blushing. He started to greet Chihiro respectfully, but his voice cracked. Akira felt her face getting hot and red. She turned to look away, only for another familiar person to grab her. "Oh, la niña sagrada, you're getting big," said a woman's voice. Inez Vasquez was a friend of the Robinson family, and she was just as dirty and messy as Akira had always known her to be. The red-haired Venezuelan was dressed in mechanics' coveralls that were stained with motor oil. She had no doubt spent the morning arms deep inside of an engine. Inez ruffled Akira's hair and smiled at her before going to speak with Chihiro. When Inez stepped away, an android with a rectangular head and a single red eye looked at Akira, then tilted its head to one side. "I don't know what she's talking about." The android spoke in a voice that was extremely sassy, snarky, and full of suppressed malice. "You've only grown a centimeter since you were last here. But then again, my sensor hasn't been cleaned in a while, so I might be mistaken." "Good to see you too, Julian," Akira mumbled. Julian the android started to say something in reply, but he was abruptly pushed out of the way by a small person who was so eager to see Akira that she bowled over a machine twice her own size. Akira grabbed and tightly hugged her one and only friend in the world. "Scar!" Akira cried. "Kira!" the girl replied. Scarlett Freeman was a Caucasian girl, roughly the same age as Akira. She had platinum blonde hair, green eyes, and the cutest, most harmless face you could possibly imagine on a teenage girl. Scarlett and Akira held one another and jumped around for a few seconds, squealing so loudly that even Asuna seemed to be aware of the racket they were making. After a moment, the joyful reunion was cut short by the final friend of the Robinsons making his appearance. "Let's save the happy reunions for when we get out of the sun," declared a man's voice. "Girls, you must be cooking alive out here. Come inside and cool off." Akira looked away from Scarlett and felt as though she'd been struck dumb. Emmanuel Espinosa looked even dreamier than in his picture. He was a full 12 years older than Akira, standing tall and proud with lean but noticeable muscles and a smile that made Akira's heart flutter. Wavy blonde hair framed his face in a way that Akira thought was perfect. When Emmanuel turned around to lead everyone inside the building, Akira and Scarlett both followed him closely. Keeping their eyes locked on him, both girls wore a blissful, dreamy expression on their faces as though they were being lured away by the mythical Pied Piper. Akira was vaguely aware of the fact that she must have looked like a zombie as she shuffled along after Emmanuel, leaned forward, panting a little as she kept pace. Emmanuel was right. Akira desperately needed to cool off. As she, her family, and her friend followed him into the building that now served as XCOM headquarters, she felt as though her body was superheating beyond all reason.